Hello, Internet. I'm Evan Dashevsky, features editor with PCMag.com. Welcome to The Convo. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about evolution. Not only are we going to delve into the latest research about all the forces that came together to create this, but we're also going to talk about how technology will impact the future of evolution in potentially really big ways. It's actually not super crazy to think that your kids or grandkids might be a different species than you. What? Okay, so to help us sort this all out, we wanted to talk to someone familiar with the bleeding edge of biomedical research. My guest today is the star of numerous TED Talks, and check those out. They are great. The co-founder of Excel Venture Management, which helps build biomedical startups, and he is one of the co-authors of the new book, Evolving Ourselves. JUAN Enriquez, welcome to The Convo.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now for those of you at home, the show is called The Convo, not The Dialogue. So if you are watching live on Facebook and you have any questions, drop them in the comments and Social Pete will read them throughout the show. If you're watching this later after the fact or listening on the podcast and you do still have a question, good luck with that. Okay, so JUAN, I really like this book a lot. It's a fascinating deep dive into how evolutionary science interacts with history, with culture, with health. And the science is presented in such a way that even dummies like me and Social Pete can understand it. And anyone who's taken high school biology is aware of how species evolve via the Darwinian principles of survival of the fittest. But the way you tell it, the story of evolution is actually much more complex than just genes. Now, don't get too excited, any intelligent designers out there, because we're still talking science. But what I found kind of mind-blowing is the idea that complex species, such as we humans, actually have 4 different types of genomes. What is that all about?
So the really interesting thing about biology in our bodies is we're moving from reading genomes to writing them. Uh-huh. And across time, our genomes have been rewritten in a whole series of different ways. So if we are next to the sun, that changes our DNA. And if we smoke, it changes our DNA. And if we end up having horrible experiences while we're in the womb, that changes the grandchild's DNA.
Right.
So there's a whole series of different ways of changing DNA. You can change it at the genetic level, which is the genome, which are the letters of DNA.
Sure.
Or you can change them at the expression of that DNA, or you can change them in the microbes in your body because you've got trillions of microbes in your body, and they're symbiotic, they help you digest. Or you can change them because you do a whole series of things during your life.
Yeah.
So what's fascinating about this stuff is we used to think it was all genetically pre-programmed, and now we've found a whole series of ways of intervening, including viruses.
Right. Now, let's talk about some of the non-genetic factors that cause evolution to veer off in one way or another. Now, in your book, you talk about how obesity rates have risen all over the developed world. But here's the weird part about that, is that it's also risen in domesticated animals, and it's even risen in lab rats. Now, there might just be some invisible fat magic in the air, or you say this is partly due to processed foods and sedentary lifestyles, but you also think a main contributor is antibiotics. How do you mean that? Like, how did that affect it?
So, one of the very strange things that's happening is we have this epidemic of things like autism and obesity and allergies. So our grandparents, I don't ever recall them asking any of their guests, do you have any allergies, before they invited them over for dinner.
I never heard of peanut allergies until a good 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And all of a sudden it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And autism is everywhere.
Yeah.
And Asperger's is everywhere. And obesity is one more of those symptoms. So what we're seeing is a whole pile of obese people and obese animals. And I can understand why a diet of, whatever fast food every day would lead to human obesity.
Right.
But why lab rats?
Right.
Why wild birds? Why a whole series of animals that are sitting out there? And part of what's happening is on farms, what we do is we feed animals very small doses of antibiotics. And it's not to make them well because they've been sick. We feed it to them as growth promotants. Because what it does is it kills some of the microbes in their stomach, so the nutrients get absorbed by the animal, not by the microbes. And when that leaches out into the environment, what may be happening is even wild animals may be getting obese because of very small doses of antibiotics.
Weird.
It's just totally weird.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
No, so your book is kind of filled with like little tidbits of just like how things, particularly humans, are evolving. Now, one thing that was kind of struck me was blue eyes are disappearing, at least in America. Can you explain, like, what's the mode by which that's happening?
So again, blue eyes are a very strange mutation. They start about 10,000 years ago in the Black Sea.
Yeah.
And they're attractive enough that all of a sudden people with blue eyes have a better chance of reproducing and having kids, even though it's a recessive trait. But now you're getting so much sort of global interchange and culture and intermarriage.
Everyone's doing it.
That everyone's doing it.
Yeah.
And, you know, usually at New York universities.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden you get, you know, a whole series of folks who never would have met each other, who would never intermix. And because blue eyes are a recessive trait, they may go away.
Yep. So it's like a weird how just like cultural norms, because there was perhaps more of a prohibition against interracial dating or anything like that, that's kind of like changed kind of who we are. For anybody who's just joined us, we're talking about the future of evolution. If you have any questions, drop it in the comments, and Social Pete will read them later in the show. Explain the sexy nerd theory.
So there's a whole series of things that we do that have become incredibly valuable. So the ability to focus on things like computer coding, absolutely obsessively.
Super sexy.
Super sexy because all of a sudden the nerds are the people who've got the Ferraris. And all of a sudden they've got the high-rise apartments, and that didn't used to be the case. And so all of a sudden, all these nerds that were very shy, that didn't have a social standing, are the cool kids on campus. And that, in a strange way, may be reinforcing autism and maybe reinforcing Asperger's. It's in a sort of mating theory where you have these clusters of people who are obsessively focused on something.
Who would tend to be, some of that population tend to be of Asperger's, is what you're saying. Gotcha.
And they never would have met because they weren't very social, but all of a sudden they're working at the same companies and they're working at the same universities and they're very successful at what they do, and they meet people who may have the same traits. And you may be getting these clusters of reinforcement across some of these traits.
So Silicon Valley is to blame for the rise of autism.
You know, the very strange thing about autism, it's happened so fast in what was supposedly a genetic disease. And if it's a genetic disease, it should take centuries to play out across the population. And instead, we've seen it play out across decades in this absolutely massive curve. So there's several things that I think are going on. The first is we're paying more attention to it. The second is we've made the autism spectrum far wider. So we're now defining people who've got Asperger's and a series of other conditions within the autism spectrum. But even if you say half of those cases are cases where we're just paying more attention and there's more pharma and there's more diagnosis, the other half is correlated, and correlation is not causation, but it's correlated to some very strange things. So it's correlated to elderly parents. So the older your parents, the greater your chance of having autism. It's correlated to obesity. It's correlated to living near a chemical or pesticide area. So in Korean cities, and Koreans have a much higher index of autism than does the US, if you live in a city that's near a chemical plant, your chances are far higher than if you live somewhere else. And so there's, I think, a whole series of symptoms of rewiring our brains because of things that we're doing that are different, that are leading to symptoms that are diagnosed as autism, which I think is going to turn out to be a whole series of diseases like cancer.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the future, where we go from here. So one of the technologies I've heard a lot of people talk about is CRISPR. So can you give me perhaps the elevator pitch explanation of what CRISPR is and why are people so excited about it?
So CRISPR is this very strange thing they found in yogurt, of all places. So there are these scientists
Thank you, yogurt.
sitting at Danone yogurt, and they figure out that they're trying to figure out how do you avoid big vats of yogurt from being contaminated. And when they figure out the vats that are contaminated and those that aren't, they figure out that the vats that are resistant to contamination have taken basically mug shots of the contaminants, and whenever the mug shot appears in a virus or something, then all of a sudden all the antibodies are displayed. So they take that tool and they use it together with a couple of other tools to create the equivalent of Legos where you can swap these long strands of DNA. So DNA, this spiral staircase, has a whole series of letters of genetic code. And in the same way as you can rewrite a sentence on your tablet and say, I love you or I hate you, you can do the same thing now with genetic code. And what's fascinating about that is if you think of this little tangerine as a diskette that executes gene code, what it's doing is when it drops to the ground, then it begins to execute letters. And those are the 4 letters of DNA. And the first letters say A, T, C, A, A, G, G, and that means make a little root off this thing. And then the next letters say T, C, G, A, and you get a little stem coming out. And then G, T, C, A, make a couple of leaves, and then G, C, A, make some flowers, and then A, G, C, and you get a couple more of these. Now, what's interesting about CRISPR and other instruments is you can swap genes in this thing. And if you swap, call it 1 in 1,000 letters of this thing, this tangerine becomes an orange. And if you swap another 1 in 1,000, this becomes a lemon.
Right.
Or it becomes a grapefruit.
And once you map the genome, you'll be able to do kind of whatever you want?
Well, not whatever you want, but see, we're moving very rapidly from reading genomes, which was the whole era of let's sequence the human genome. Let's figure out what those 3.2 billion letters that are in each of your cells do. And now we're entering a period where we're rewriting genomes. So it's not, I'm going to read the genome of this thing, it's I'm going to begin to rewrite it, and CRISPR is a very powerful instrument to swap genes in and out.
Well, let's talk about staying young and beautiful forever. Okay, so you mentioned in the book that scientists were able to switch some genes off and on in creatures like worms, and they were able to extend their lives by 500%. That sounds great to me, so can we do that in humans?
So, we're entering this period, which is a really interesting period where instead of evolution being a random process, where some people are born with this gene, some people are born with this gene, what you're beginning to get is a period where people can begin to say, if I can identify the right genes, I can modify a fundamental trait in humans. And that's much easier to do with single letters. So if you change one specific letter out of 3.2 billion letters in your genome, you don't get cystic fibrosis.
Okay.
Right? So that's an easy one. A much more complex one is beginning to change traits like athletic ability, like height, like ability to do X or Y, keep your hair. Not that I'd mention that for any reason.
Sure.
But as you're thinking about this stuff, we are going to be able to change some fundamental traits, probably including longevity in humans. Because we know that some things, Joshua trees, live for thousands of years. We know that some animals live much longer. We know that if we change these little kite-like things on the end of cells that are called telomeres, we may be able to get our cells to live far longer. And the flip side of this is, as we figure out how to make cells immortal, we may also figure out the key to curing cancer.
Wow.
Because cancer are almost immortal cells. They're cells that won't die. So the quest for longevity is also partly the quest for solving cancer.
What are the ethics of doing these sort of trials in humans, and like what kind of research is going on right now?
So look, ethics is one of the most interesting and under-discussed areas we have, partly because we're in such an era of political polarization that
I hadn't noticed.
Really?
Yeah.
People tend to take one side, or they tend to take the other side, and
Right.
it tends to be very extreme.
Yeah.
And then the lawyers have driven this to the point where all the companies, all the organizations have these ethics manuals, which are the single most boring books on earth. Do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
That's not where ethics are interesting, and that's not where they're complicated. Where they get complicated is on questions like the one you just asked, which is, should we modify human beings? And most of our answers would be, no, probably not, except that we've already modified human beings in absolutely fundamental ways.
Right.
And let me give you an example. Let's talk about a completely non-controversial topic,
Yeah.
which is sex.
Okay.
So imagine somehow you find a time machine, and you're able to take grandpa and grandma age 17, and you put them on the front porch of your home, and it's spring, and you're going to have a birds and the bees talks with them.
Right.
Okay, so you sit down, Grandpa and Grandma, age 17, and you say, okay, Grandpa, Grandma, let me explain things about sex today to you. So you can now have sex and not have a baby.
Right.
Right? And for all of human history, normally, sex leads to baby pretty quickly.
True.
Now, sex plus whatever, no baby.
Right.
So you've separated, right, conception from sex. That would seem very strange to them.
Right.
Then you go the next step, and what you tell them is, Grandpa, Grandma, I'm going to do my graduate degree, and therefore what I'd like to do is I'd like to freeze my eggs. And I'd like to have a baby in 5 years. And I don't have to have sex to have that baby because I can fertilize it in vitro. And suddenly what you've done is you've separated sex from human contact. And they would look at you and they'd think, what is wrong with my grandchild? Right? Why are they making these stories up?
Yeah.
And then you'd have the last talk, which is, and oh, by the way, because I can have a surrogate mother, and because I can freeze a fertilized egg, I could have identical twins with today's technology born every 50 years for the next 200 years. So all of a sudden, then you've decoupled sex from time. Right? At this point, your 17-year-old grandparents have walked off the porch because they think you're absolutely insane. They don't know what you're drinking. Yeah. And we take it for granted. So as we think about the ethics of changing human beings, things that will seem absolutely inconceivable to you and I will be something that our grandkids will take for granted. It's a really strange world we're entering.
So moving away from gross sex talks with your grandparents, don't do that. So let's jump maybe a bit more into, we kind of went to science fiction with the time machine, but let's go into further science fiction. Now, I've talked to a lot of experts about how we're going to live on Mars. You had Stephen Petranek. You mentioned him in your book. We had him on the show a while ago. So he's talking about how we're going to live on Mars, is that in the long run, we're going to have to terraform the planet, but we might have to actually genetically engineer humans and plants to get to survive in this literally alien environment. I don't know, how far off is that sort of thing where you could live in an environment, breathe carbon dioxide that's a lot less in a very cold environment? How far away is that?
Start with even the most basic of things, right? So each of us is born out of a single fertilized cell. And that cell becomes 2 cells, and that becomes 4 cells, and that becomes 8 cells. So for the first 16 divisions, these are pluripotent stem cells, and then it's like skiers at the top of the hill. So if they go down here, then they become bone. And if they go down here, they become muscle. And if they go down here, they become stomach. So the very strange thing about the cells in your body is each of them has your entire gene code in it. So each of them knows how to make every part of your body. And as you're thinking about that, that's a cascade of going from 1 cell to 10 trillion cells. Start with the most basic parameter on Mars. Change the gravity on that cascade.
Okay.
So as you go from 1 to 10 trillion cells. We don't know if we could have a human being born on Mars under different gravity. Because we don't know what the effect of gravity is on this should be muscle, and this should be stomach, and this should be this, and this should be that. Then you get into more complicated things like it's almost impossible for NASA woman astronauts to go to Mars because the lifetime radiation exposure is exceeded and no federal employee can absorb that high a risk of radiation. Men have, in general, slightly less fat, so they could just barely make it. But women's bone loss is much less than men. So men can get there, but they're going to be weak-kneed when they get there, as opposed to women. So there's all kinds of interesting and strange stuff that happens. You modify your brain. A lot of astronauts end up with vision problems. All of those things are going to have to be solved just to get to Mars.
Okay.
Other planets living in a liquid methane sea off of Neptune or Jupiter, that's a different ballgame.
Sure. Okay, so now you and your co-author Steve Gullins.
Yes.
Okay, so you also run a venture capital firm for biomedical startups. So if I'm gonna get my money together and start investing in biomedical startups, give me some free advice. Where's the money gonna be in this field? I'm your competition, but you can let me know.
There you go. I'll let you in on a secret.
Sure.
the biggest single driver of the global economy going forward is going to be the ability to read and write life code. So that's a big sentence, right? But just imagine for 1 minute that you and I were watching the movie The Graduate.
Right.
And you get that iconic scene, not the seduction scene, but the other one where the old guy gives the young kid advice, puts his arm around him, and says, plastics.
Right.
Wrong, right? Because the movie's released in 1967.
Yeah.
And at that point, Silicon Valley was just being birthed. So Fairchild was selling semiconductors. Intel was founded the year after that. And Silicon Valley explodes.
Right.
And if the advice had been silicon or computers, maybe that guy would have been a billionaire.
Right, right.
Instead, he's a Tupperware salesman.
Right.
It's really sad.
Yeah, yeah.
So today, the word of advice for people who are thinking about investing or thinking about this is, your business is going to be changed by the ability to code life. It's going to change energy. It's going to change agriculture. It's going to change information storage. It's going to change who's rich and who's poor. It's going to change what kind of industries you have. There's space for everybody to learn this and invest in it.
GMOs, worthy of the hysteria about them with the labeling and such, or not so much?
So, look, GMOs are something that humans have been doing for thousands of years.
Yeah.
If you take the Incas back in Machu Picchu, potatoes were really poisonous.
Yeah.
And so you had to wash them, and you had to do all kinds of things to them to take the poison out of them. And eventually they bred hundreds and then thousands of different species of potato that would store, that would give you this nutrient, that would survive this plague. Really smart idea.
Yeah.
Right? It allowed the Inca civilization to thrive. When you go to the markets today in Cusco, they're completely unlike U.S. markets or European markets in terms of potatoes. You see whole aisles worth of different potatoes. You got wonderful potato tastings. It's really good to do that, right? It's been really good for human beings. We eat tomatoes, which used to be the size of your thumbnail, green and poisonous. And now you've got all these wonderful heirloom tomatoes. We've modified plants so that mustard weed gives you kale, gives you cauliflower, gives you broccoli out of breeding one plant. Now, the big difference today is what used to take decades or centuries, we're doing in a much more intelligent way most of the time, and we're doing it very deliberately. I'd like this to do that. And yeah, that is intelligent design in a strange way.
Yeah.
It's not something that particularly anguishes me. That's not the stuff that scares me.
Yeah. So let's finish up with a lightning round that we get a couple questions we ask everyone. You use Windows or Mac?
Windows.
Okay. Android or iOS?
Android.
Okay. What was a recent electronics purchase that you've really been impressed by? Like you feel like you're living in the future?
I haven't bought it, but I recently went to an AR VR conference and looked at all the various things that the AR VR world are doing and how they're interfacing. And some of the headsets are getting interesting.
Yeah.
They still make me a little dizzy, but they're getting there, and I can see how that's going to change a bunch of stuff. There was one device that was really fun, and what it does is it creates currents of air that match what's going on the screen.
Okay.
So as you're watching bubbles on the screen, if you put your hand over this, you can feel the bubbles pop against your hand.
Oh, weird.
And what they're doing, the main purchaser of this is the auto industry. And what you do is when the air is coming out of the air conditioning system, you tap on it virtually on the air thing, and a virtual knob appears.
Okay.
So you start to turn a knob in the air, and you can change the volume or change the station or do whatever you want to control, but it's a virtual air modifier. It's really strange technology.
Oh, wow. Now we'll have to check that out in the future edition of the Convo. Where do you get your daily news and information from?
I'm an omnivore for information. I wake up every morning absolutely terrified of opening Twitter and seeing what beasts come out of that. But that's really useful if you curate your science feeds. Yeah. Facebook is usually fun if you curate it right and you follow the right people. I'm still an oldie, so I still read 3 newspapers every day systematically. Wow. Very little TV. A lot of books. You come to my house, you're in danger of being hit by books.
You haven't gone to the to digital editions yet?
No, I like the physical thing. I like
Yeah.
bending the pages. I like writing in the pages. I like arguing with the authors. I
Yeah,
like
yeah.
going back to them.
Ed Snowden, traitor or hero? I know it's out of your wheelhouse, but
I like Ed Snowden a
Yeah.
whole lot better than I like Julian Assange.
true. I totally agree. Yeah,
You know, I think Julian is not on the side of
humanity.
humanity, and I think Snowden, it took a great deal of courage to do what he did, regardless of how you feel about the thing. And by the way, we've changed a lot of things because of what he exposed. Why he did it, I don't have enough information.
Yeah. Will the singularity occur in 2054?
I keep trying to bet singularity people a case of really expensive wine that they're going to die.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they won't take the bet. I think all of us are going to die.
Okay.
The really interesting question is, I'll tell you the weird question.
Okay.
The weird question is if you take a mouse head and you transplant it onto another mouse,
Yeah.
what happens? And let me put this in the context of a heart transplant. When they did the first heart transplants, they brought in the wife of the donor.
Right.
And they said, do you feel anything?
Right.
Do you recognize this woman? And the answer was obviously no. Right? But for thousands of years, I gave her my heart, she took my heart, she broke my heart. We thought emotion was right here. No, this is a muscle.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's transplant a head from this mouse to this mouse. Two options. The new mouse still loves Minnie Mouse. The new mouse still remembers what it's afraid of, still remembers what it likes, still remembers how to navigate the maze. If that is true, then the only question is the stuff here downloadable into anything besides this?
Yep. But they have done this experiment before, correct?
They haven't done it to the point where they can tell whether you're transplanting memory,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
But if you can transplant memory, then
Yeah.
can you download it into anything other than a similar body? And if you can download it into a similar body, then all kinds of interesting things happen because you don't have to have memory in a carbon-based structure down here.
Yeah.
Option number two, you transplant, everything goes away. Okay, then where's memory and where's consciousness?
Right.
Where are all those things?
Right.
If this is a muscle, boy, does that lead to interesting questions.
Right, right, right. Is there intelligent life out there?
One of the wonderful things about living in Cambridge, Mass. these days in Somerville, the Irish pubs, which are the rowdy Irish pubs on weekends, open up on Tuesdays and Wednesdays to do science talks.
Okay.
And so the borough opened up last Tuesday to one of the greatest scientists who discovered some of the first exoplanets. We didn't even know there were planets outside there until 1990.
Right, right.
Right? And now we found billions of planets out there. We think that about 1 in 4 of those planets is Earth-like. So either 80% to 150% of the size of the Earth, which is what would accommodate life that may look something like us. We will know by 2019 or 2020 if there's a blue-green signature on those planets, because we're about to launch a telescope that is so powerful that it could distinguish a candle sitting in front of the sun.
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's the order of magnitude of pixels this thing's looking at. And if it ever sees a blue-green signature, that means life is common in the universe. Because the chances that life exists on only one other planet that you see a blue-green signature and nowhere else are about 0.
Right, right.
That is a calendar-changing event, right? That's like the day we figured out the Earth isn't flat. And it happens, you know, in a 1-hour news cycle,
Right,
which
right.
is fascinating. I mean, just the implications of that first sighting of life somewhere else. Big deal.
So 2 years until everything changes. Is Bigfoot out there?
No.
No. Okay. I have never gotten one yes. I'm going to keep asking that until it happens. What is a recent, and finally, what is a recent task, little or big, that you've been able to master, been able to download information into your brain through analog means?
You know, I love learning.
Yeah.
The nice thing about being a venture capitalist
Yeah.
every day is like Christmas.
Sure.
Because all these smart people walk into your office and say, I want to build this with you. And then you get these science magazines, and people have discovered X, and they've discovered Y, and they've discovered Z, and if you're going to invest in this stuff, you better understand it.
Right.
So, you really dig deep, and you get at least a master's in whatever you're going to be investing in.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to say, for anybody who's watching, give us a like, give us a share. We always appreciate those. Check out some of our past interviews. We've done a lot of them. Okay, and I mentioned earlier, the Convo is now an audio podcast, just launched this week, available on iTunes. Maybe social people will put that into the comments. And give us if you like these, give us a subscribe, give us a like, give us a review. We really appreciate those. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Social Pete. Thanks to JUAN EnriquEZ for being here. And as always, be good to each other. Peace.